Yeah, of course, President Biden's argument has been that as we try to bring back these jobs, it's about narrowing that divide, and raising the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour would certainly go a long way towards that goal. Zach, we should remind our viewers we are waiting for President Biden to deliver this speech on the state of the economy. This first jobs report as president, certainly a bit of good news and bad news, if you will. It was certainly a disappointment, Zach, when you think about where the expectations were. And yet, when you think about the steep losses we saw back in December, this is at least some return to growth, even if we're just talking about 49,000 jobs. When you look over the last several months, though, we're now looking at 3 straight months of disappointing numbers. And to that point, we did hear from our guest earlier today who said, look, this strengthens the case for this stimulus plan that President Biden has been pushing, because it shows that there is still more need that's out there. This is not the time to go small. And that seems to be the message we're likely going to hear from the president. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen also expected to join him there, as well as Vice President Kamala Harris. And we've heard, Zach, from Janet Yellen saying, at least when she was in the confirmation hearing, she said, look, we've got to go big. This is not the time to think about pulling back, even if we are making small strides towards getting the economy back on track.
Yeah, and it's a point that we've heard stressed by President Biden. We just heard that clip earlier in the show, and with good reason, because it's exactly what he saw play out during the 08-09 recession, when we were kind of seeing the same thing. You had states moving in the opposite direction than what the federal government was doing. It's a key point of what Democrats have been pushing for in getting additional aid to states on the state and local level, something Republicans have pushed back on. And the reason he's so adamant about it is because it contributed to a slower recovery than what you would have expected in the aftermath of the Great Recession, because those forces were moving in opposite directions. So there is truth to the fact that, yeah, we're hearing from a lot of economists out there that you would want to go bigger rather than smaller on this next wave. But there's still, I guess, also valid questions on the other side about potentially what does that do to maybe inflation, particularly when we see another round of stimulus checks out here. What's the Goldilocks number there? I think it's fair to maybe say, especially if you are the president now in power, and you promised voters too on the campaign trail that you were going to be delivering these stimulus checks. It's very hard to walk back from that overall 2,000 number that you were talking about. But it is interesting to see, kind of history repeating itself here when we're trying to learn from what happened back then. And specifically, I think, Aikiko, how, in lockstep, we've been hearing kind of the same message, not just from President Biden and Congress, but also from Fed Chair Jerome Powell and Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen as well. And I think the jobs report today kind of proves their point.
Yeah, the counter argument from Republican lawmakers, of course, has been that we just passed a stimulus bill back in December. We haven't seen the full impact of that. $1.9 trillion is too high of a price tag. They've also argued for more targeted relief. So instead of going for the $2,000 checks overall, looking at where the pain points are in the economy. And the jobs numbers today certainly highlight what we have known for some time, which is how this pandemic has really affected communities of color disproportionately. And I mentioned this at the top of the show, but I think it's worth highlighting again when you look at the unemployment rate right now, 6.3%. That was a drop. So that does point to the needle moving in the right direction. But there is a huge divide between what we're seeing with white Americans, 5.7%, Hispanics is at 8.6%, and with Black Americans, the unemployment rate at 9.2%. So disproportionately affecting some of those communities. Overall, though, as we talk about these improvements in the economy, Zach, it's important to point out there are still roughly 10 million Americans who are unemployed. That is still a significant number. And again, as we wait for the president to speak, that's certainly going to be something he's going to be pointing to say there's still a lot of pain out there, and this is not the time to pull back.
Yeah, and to follow up on your point there, when you're talking about the unemployment rate dropping to 6.3%, something that a lot of people might look at and say, hey, that's a good thing. It's also paired with the fact that the labor force participation rate also dropped. You have more than 400,000 workers leaving the labor force. So generally, when that's the driving factor, when you have that denominator shrinking, less people in the labor force, that's not a good thing. You want to see it flip the other side. And to your point, yes, we're still at the jobs total that we were back in November of 2017, I think it's been a few years since we've been at that number, so it's still a long way to go when we're talking about getting back to the number. It was actually November of 2015, so even worse than I was thinking. So yeah, a long way to go, obviously, to get back to where they want to be in this recovery. And I think that those are two things. We've also seen it that it's been very lumpy, right? That's something we've talked about off the earlier part of the show. We heard from Emily kind of walking through which sectors have seen that recovery. Same thing we heard from the Lieutenant Governor of Hawaii earlier in the week, talking about how they were able to recover, and the reason being that they were, focusing in on getting the pandemic under control. An important point here, but it looks like, do we have Nancy Pelosi there? Is that what I'm seeing here, Akiko?
Yeah, it looks like the House Speaker, Nancy Pelosi, there speaking. We don't see President Biden just yet, but he is expected to begin speaking in just a few minutes here. Zach, to pick up on your point here about sectors that have really been hurt the hardest, retail, of course, a big one, job loss of 38,000, although they did see a bump in December because of the additional hiring during the holidays. Hospitality sector certainly been hit hard significantly too. And, if we go back to the wage discussion we were having with Jared earlier, I mean, those are the jobs that would be affected in a big way if there is any kind of bump in the minimum wage. So we're sort of trying to connect all the dots here together, but there is a real divide right now over in Washington in terms of the debate on how lawmakers should be moving forward as you look to piece together all of the economic data, some bright spots, but certainly the overall picture here is that the economic recovery is in fact stalling.
Yeah, and such a tricky piece of this too. I mean, there's only so much money you can throw at the problem of a pandemic, right? And it's something we've heard from Fed Chair Jerome Powell time and time again. He said it basically every time anyone's put a mic in his face, is that you cannot get back to a full recovery until the pandemic is under control. So it is optimistic to see, more money being dedicated to that and getting vaccines out and the necessary measures to take to really boost those efforts. But I mean, it's something that we saw when we looked at the Hawaii recovery is really, you didn't see that recovery start to take place and moving from 1/5 of Hawaiians on unemployment insurance down to about under 5% now. Until they started to get cases under control. And they did that with pretty strict measures, testing travelers to the island. And as we discussed, I mean, Hawaii is a little bit of a unique case since they are an island and can control travelers coming in a little bit better. But we've already heard from President Biden kind of talking about the need to do so at a national level. So interesting to see all those things play out, too, just because it's so inextricably linked to get the pandemic under control first before we see a full recovery.
Yeah, and important to note that we're mentioning a state like Hawaii because they have had the highest unemployment rate and they have been affected in a significant way because of the travel restrictions that have been in place.